Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
This morning, we're talking about everyone's favorite topic, trauma, and religion, which is also everyone's
So,
favorite topic,
so it's two
combined.
two favorites in one.
Combined.
What is that? Two minced in one. What was that? What was
What?
that? Was that what commercial was that?
I don't know.
Yeah. It
It's
was
been a
some
while.
breath mint. Yeah, just shows how old I am.
Yeah, I only care about Mentos, the fresh maker.
Yes. Well,
Um,
hi everybody, and yeah. So the pandemic is unleashing all kinds of religious reflection, much of which is traumatic. And so we want to talk about that today. And I think we should begin. Oh, great! Yeah, here's the
but
formulation.
yeah, so we're talking about religious trauma, but there's a couple of ways that we can approach this, and maybe you have your own spin and you want to leave a comment or a question. Um, but yeah, the pre-existing religious trauma, the way that our we kind of react negatively to kind of our conditioning and our experiences of trauma, that's happening now because crises bring out the worst aspects of religiosity. But then also there's new ways. We're developing new ways of being traumatized by religious systems and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're going to be talking about both these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, one of the favorites, and this is sort of a new way, I guess, but it's so old that it's not really new. So there's this very common stream in American fundamentalist Christianity, right? That every big problem is the result of somebody's bad behavior. And of course,
Yes.
being gay, um, women working, all those kinds of things.
Liberalism, just in
Yeah,
general.
liberalism in general. Yeah, and so this idea that AIDS was the gay disease, and so God's punishment, some kind of big plague, big storm, big bad thing, whatever it happens to be, is God's punishment for the bad behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've seen a lot of that going around. As I said, it's pretty common. It's almost so common it's a little boring at this point, but still, it shows the underlying dynamics of religion that becomes traumatizing, which is this notion that there's this big bad invisible guy somewhere
Mm-hmm.
who's out to whack us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then it creates this anxiety about making sure you don't screw up. You have to do everything right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Even if we don't think about it as like to appease some sort of angry God, it's just this is generic pressure to live up to some sort of standard that we just know we have to live up to. Otherwise, we're doing something wrong and we'll be punished.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so one of the ways, Mark, I wonder if you could share some, because I thought this was interesting. We were talking about, as I said, there are some of these big overarching things that you hear about all the time. But before the broadcast, we were talking about some of the more subtle manifestations of this, yeah, I wonder if you could share something about that, just about the whole issue of being stuck inside and not being able to do certain religious things.
Yeah, and I'll speak to this as someone who has experienced both sides of kind of church cultivation. So I've done the pastoral thing, I've church planted, and I've also just attended church. But there's a sort of need to perform a certain way, or you feel anxiety. And right now that's being undercut. So those of you who are ministers might know that if you visit another church, it's hard not to cringe a lot and feel like almost a psychic pain if it's not being performed the right way, just the way you feel anxious often if you're not performing the right way. And so now all of a sudden there's no way to perform the right way. And so it's like there's all this worry, this anxiety that is beyond just maybe normal concern or like this sort of concern you'd expect, but like an anxiety response. Or people who are at church attenders, like feeling that same sort of anxiety. We're not able to do this right. And that, to me, that's a traumatic response. because we're conditioned that this is what it's supposed to look like in order to be properly religious. And there's all sorts of little judgments, like people being like, I don't know, this Zoom church thing sets a bad precedent, as though like, look, what else are we supposed to do? Like, why is there's a simmering lack of grace around this? And to me, that's all tied up in trauma.
Right. And then another interesting manifestation of that, the tremendous conversation and angst around communion. Right. And so, so all across mostly so-called mainline denominations, there's just been all this, again, this angst of, can we somehow have communion online, or what are we going to do about communion, or we have to be together physically to do communion, otherwise it's not right. And of course, all of that, again, lurking in the back of all of that is this giant invisible guy that is not going to be happy with us. And so somehow, if we do the wrong thing, the consequences are not going to be good.
And it's, to me, that's where it's subtle, because I would love to be gathered with people right now, so I can long for a fuller experience of community and religious practice, and that's good. But when it becomes this sort of pressure, like I have to do this, otherwise it's not right, like that anxious response, that's where it's tapping into this trauma. And so much that's problematic with a lot of religions, especially Christianity in America as a dominant religion. So much of it's driven by this sort of need to perform the right way.
Right.
Otherwise, and why are we anxious about that? What's going to happen? Well, that's why it's a trauma. it's a trigger response. There's no rational answer to that.
Right.
Unless you really believe, like, well, if you don't do this right, you're going to go to the bad place. Like, there's that version of it. But most of us are just kind of like generically anxious and don't know why.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then in terms of some of these past traumas coming up, one of the ones that I find really interesting, and there's some very odd ways, I think, or paradoxical ways that this is manifesting, is this whole issue around cleanliness, right? So there are certain, a lot of, and this does seem to be more the case within fundamentalist groups, right? There's a big focus on purity and cleanliness, right? And a lot of times, of course, this revolves around sex. But it also revolves around eating, and in a lot of particularly Orthodox Jewish world, eating, hand washing, who you can be with, who you can hang out with, and of course, so then this virus comes along, and that is now this invisible agent of impurity.
Yes. And we've had versions of this, like, in the Catholic worker scene, or anyone who does hospitality kind of as a ministry thing. We've already had this sort of anxiety triggered by this sort of purity stuff around bed bugs, right? So that's been a way of regulating who we can be with, but this pandemic is like, now it's not, now anybody could have it. So before, like, I've had conversations with people about their concerns, or I've noticed concerns about who's carrying the virus. And it tends to fall along these sorts of tropes of like people that you normally perceive as being dirtier in general, which is like, it's not entirely rational to think that way.
Right. Yeah.
So this sort of way of, this sort of way of, I often wonder if we evolved a certain way that makes sense with the disgust kind of response to things and purity, but then it's like at a certain point we know better, but we still can't help but fall back on that early way that we evolved.
Yeah. So I realize I'm feeling kind of lonely. Like nobody said hi. Nobody's commented. Is anybody there?
This might be a good opportunity for me to put up that picture, because I know that'll generate stuff. Dan asked me to share a picture I've shared it before. If you follow me on Facebook, it's
Mark
a picture of my
loves
youth.
this picture.
because it shows me like this is performative Mark. This is when I was in my teens. This is fundamentalist me. So you can totally see how very patriotic was, but that was me at peak fundamentalism.
There you go.
And so this picture is being, I'm very performative. I'm performing a certain way of fidelity to God and country here in this picture that like, this was not ironic. I was wearing a, you know, a freaking American flag on my shirt. And I share that because like, for me, that sort of need to perform a certain way, you know, I still struggle with that, right? So I was telling you before, and I'm not going to get into names, but I actually, I've pastored for a long time, and then we stopped having church services, and so we haven't been regular churchgoers for a while, and I still get shamed by people that my son isn't receiving proper religious instruction, and I've actually lost friends over this because
this is horrible.
And I'm like, what's going behind that? What's the point? What's going to happen if somehow my 12-year-old son doesn't go to Sunday school yet? And where is that anxiety from them? Why are they so willing to unfriend me? Is it because they're so worried about me that they want to cut me off from their life? Or is it triggering their religious trauma?
Right. Yeah. Hi, Catherine. Thanks for saying hi. I feel better now.
Okay. We're not alone.
Good. We're not alone. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, exactly. And that, you know, and it's interesting how that religious trauma can often get projected then onto the kids, right? Oh my gosh, you know, and you hear these people be like, I've got to get my kid baptized, you know, I've got to get my baby baptized. I've got to get my kid to Sunday school. Oh my God, my friend is not doing this. My, you know, this, that, or the other thing. And, and for us to recognize that really this is this, you know, this really is very much this kind of innate fear, really, that's been generated of this invisible God, right? And, you know, and again, a lot of this behavior then generates very odd, oh, hey, Deborah. A lot of this generates then some of this very odd paradoxical behavior. So, for example, right now, one of the epicenters of the viral outbreak in New York City is among the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, who are still insisting on gathering for prayers, gathering for funerals, doing all kinds of gathering. Of course, they have this huge focus on purity and cleanliness, and they're now the ones that are not staying safe from this virus. So it's like, again, their obsessive need to continue these practices is actually making them the most unclean. And again, the rates of infection in these communities are right now off the charts, and it's really horrible.
Here's a great question from Catherine. This could be fun. How do you feel about calls for prayer to end the virus? You know, I have my initial response, like, and I'm realizing this is gonna maybe upset some people. I don't know, but to me, asking God to end something somehow implies that God is responsible or in control of it. And I know people who are big into God's sovereignty want to see God in control of it, but I just don't think that way. So for me, it's like, I haven't prayed one time. I've prayed for responses and how we come together and how I assume God is present in the midst of suffering. But the idea of praying to end it just starts kind of crossing a line in my head. And I don't know if that's because of my own trauma and I just don't want to go there, or if I actually have legitimate theological reasons. I don't know what you think, Dan. It's a big question.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question because it gets at this from so many different angles, right? So in order to answer that question, right, you have to talk about what is prayer. You have to talk about how does God act in the world? What does that even mean for God to have agency? you have to ask, how is the divine agency of some invisible being connected to what we understand about ecology and the way that creatures interact, and and so that notion, that sort of mechanical notion of prayer, right? That I, or even thing, or think something, and some invisible being out in the sky can get that message, And of course, there've been all kinds of funny. What was that Jim Carrey movie where he was God?
Bruce Almighty.
Yeah, Bruce Almighty. And there are all kinds of hilarious images in there, right? At one point, he's getting prayers as Post-it notes, and these like millions of Post-it notes are appearing in his office. And and then this invisible being sort of comes down and rearranges some molecules, and the virus disappears. That's absurd. I mean, it really is. It's just frankly sort of bizarrely ridiculous. Now, again, if prayer, though, is this deep listening and paying attention to what is happening and seeking guidance or wisdom or care, to then have human beings engage in things that are going to help the virus disappear, well, yeah, I mean, that's hopefully what we're doing, is trying to be wise about this. So it's a it's a great question, because it kind of enters this realm and from a lot of different angles.
Yeah, and to me, it's like, if it's a heartfelt cry of despair for relief, and you're pleading with God, like, that's an authentic emotional response. But when it starts getting to this sort of assumption that somehow this is God's doing and we don't understand it, but God's up to something through this virus, like by causing it, then you start getting into this idea, like this ties in with Faith's comment to me, in my mind. Yeah, it's all about control. I just don't see God as a controlling God. And it's certainly not how I experience God. Maybe theologically there's systems that explain it that way, but to me, God is found in presence, and there's a gentleness to God's presence. Even in the idea of wrath, it's not even about control. So this idea that somehow God uses viruses to control outcomes just doesn't make, I mean, I have no doubt there's people have theological ways of approaching this that might make some sense and might even be compassionate, but it's hard for me to go there.
Right. Yeah. And again, though, the thing about religious trauma is that, if you're sitting in a community week in and week out, especially as a child, and you're hearing this over and over again, and you're being told this over and over again, and you're being told that your every move is being watched, and what you're wearing and what you're eating and who you're associating with and what you're doing and what you're touching, it is all about then this judgment that's going to come down on you. I mean, that's then a very powerful message that gets internalized, right? And it's terrifying. I mean, it really is. And so, so then when something like this comes along, that of course is going to be kind of the go-to place, right? The go-to assumption. And I think that's where a lot of this stuff comes out of. And then of course, the people who exploit this, they're sort of the worst of the worst, because I don't think they believe any of this stuff, but they, get on TV and the internet, whatever, and they exploit this, and then they usually end it with, "Send me money," right? And so
I need to change my fundraising strategy.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So Adam, what is that?
This is a good
going here,
Adam. Hey, Adam. It's really a megalomania in the idea God is punishing others for what you believe, especially when there's little to no evidence that God believes what you do. Yeah. I mean, it's so convenient that somehow God is punishing the people that I hate. Like, that's kind of right. Somehow God is being a tool for our vengeance. Usually that's how it functions.
Yep. Yeah, right. I mean, it's the old idea that God is fashioned in our image, right? It's sort of the joke, God made humans in God's image, and then humans have returned the favor. Um, yeah, and when I teach about discernment, I mean, I talk about this all the time. Like, if you do a discernment practice and process, and at the end of it, what you come to is God wants all the things that you want, and God dislikes all the things and the people that you dislike, that's pretty much a sign that you've done the discernment process incorrectly.
Yes. I mean, to
Yeah.
me, my experience of God is one of opening up possibilities that I hadn't previously noticed. And so this idea that, God is forcefully corralling people. It's just kind of weird and gross.
Yeah. No, it's horrible.
Especially now, because people are using this. It's somehow the pandemic. It's this intensification effect.
Mm-hmm.
Most people are just doubling down on what they thought before, but I do believe that people are being shaken from their dogmatic stupor a little bit, or dogmatic slumber. I want to hope.
Yeah. Yeah. So then the other theme, right? Of course, that's coming up a lot around this is the whole end times theme, right?
I'm so glad that that's not the world I inhabit anymore.
Right. So was that a big part of your church experience? We'll have discussion about that.
Yeah. So I grew up among sort of this Venn diagram. They're not the same thing, but the kind of Pentecostal charismatic world, which is all about prophecies, and then fundamentalism, which is all about dispensations, right? And so the perfect storm is where you feel like God could be coming back anytime, and so therefore we need one big charismatic revival to usher in as many people as possible before God brings judgment. So like that's kind of the posture we were in. And so every few years there'd be another book or a prophecy about how this is it.
Right.
And you go through about 7 or 8 of those, and you kind of think, is it though? Is this the pale horse? Which horse of the apocalypse is this one? So there's the
right.
with this.
Is there a viral horse? I don't think.
Yeah, there's pestilence, right? There's
pestilence.
pestilence.
Right.
Is there a plague? I don't read the book of Revelation for fun and for shits and giggles anymore, so I don't know like what the 4 horses. But one of them somehow has disease,
right?
Plague.
Yeah.
So that one's the one riding across the land right now.
Right. Yeah, and again, I mean, the concern about this, right, is rooted in this traumatic fear, right? So that if the world is ending, I want to be on the right side of things.
Yes.
And if I'm on the wrong side of things, then it's the pool of fire for me. And I don't want the pool of fire.
Yeah, to me, there's I tend to do this inner inventory because I have been so shaped by religiosity. Even if you don't go to church, you can be shaped by this because it's in the air we breathe. There's our society, even if you don't believe in God, has a very religious structure. Like it's very performative, right? And I'm using religion can be used as a good word. I'm using it in a very pejorative way right there. But to me, if I'm being motivated by a desire to perform in order to do it right, to me, that's how I know that this isn't the fruit of the Spirit. If, however, I'm being moved to be more compassionate, present, gentle, kind, loving, even in my anger, if it's coming from a place of longing and desire and compassion, then it's good. But if it's out with this performative thing, which I see in leftist culture, by the way, all the time, atheistic, leftist, far left culture, that's bad. And so right now, this pandemic is going to intensify things. So if people are feeling more the need to perform a certain way, and they're feeling anxious that they're not performing a certain way, that's how you know there's a little bit of trauma going on there.
Right.
Or at least for me, that's the inner inventory that I do to check myself.
Right. And to me, the loving, non-traumatic religious spin on something like a pandemic is to essentially turn that whole "God is out to get you" narrative on its head, right? And to say, Okay, no. So a plague is something that arises out of an imbalance in the ecology. A plague is something that occurs when, and this is true. This doesn't have to be a plague that affects humans. I mean, right? We have chronic wasting disease in the deer population in Minnesota
Dutch
because
elm disease.
Dutch elm disease, so this can be a plague in any group of organisms. And that happens when the environment is out of balance, when the ecosystem is out of balance, when there's some sort of major change going on. And of course, again, with the deer, it's a great example. Northern tier of, we've gotten rid of all the predators except for us. And with all this massive farming, there's tons of good food everywhere for the deer. And so the population explodes. The deers get sick. The deer starve during the winter, massive amounts of deer suffering. And so that's because the ecology is out of balance. And so, so from the positive religion point of view, we can look at that and say, okay, so what are we being taught? And we could say, what is God teaching us? Not in the sense of God's doing something bad to us, but if we look at what is happening from a wisdom point of view, right, becoming wise, we say, well, wow, what we're noticing is the environment is out of balance. What we're noticing is we've created systems where we don't care for people. What we're noticing is that if we, don't prepare for difficult things, then when difficult things happen, more people suffer. If we aren't willing to learn from one another, then we, again, more people suffer. So from that point of view, God is teaching us, or we can learn these deeper ways of being loving and compassionate.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. And it's hard to do that when you're afraid.
Well, it's very hard to do that when you're
This
afraid.
is why pandemics make things more intense, is because fear. I mean, sometimes when you notice other people afraid, it can bring out the best in you. But if you're afraid, it tends to short circuit your ability to really be discerning and wise. At least, maybe, I don't want to speak for everybody, but that's how I experience it. We got a comment here from Catherine. Catherine writes, I've been thinking a lot about how religious trauma and oppressive religious messages woven into our culture have informed my general view of social change and righteousness. For example, a charismatic revival model of revolution, a martyrdom idea of what it meant to be a good person, a fundamentalist purity understanding of right politics. Are there more ways something like religious trauma can show up in secular spaces in times like this? And then she follows up, lol, Mark definitely said a lot of this while I was typing it. Great minds think alike, Catherine. But no, that's true. And I think that's you're doubling down, you're underscoring and expanding what I said, like by a lot. You're adding a lot of nuance. So it's not just repeating what I said, because to me, there is all sorts of ways, this sort of tendency to perform out of like a traumatic thing, like I have to do this right or else, kind of filters in to all kinds of spaces that we never think of as religious. But that's like dogmatism and trauma.
Yeah, I mean, Catherine, what it makes me think of was our conversation last week about the issue of, that the only sort of valid, powerful political action are big gatherings, right? And which again are often centered around a charismatic speaker, and they're like a big revival. And what we talked about is that actually a lot of the most valuable political and social change movements come from these smaller egalitarian works. Very often people who are on the margins, who are not the big up in front performative people, really just working very hard to communicate and create better, more just societies. And so I think, I mean, our whole society, right, is formed on, out of this fairly traumatic view of religion. And for those of you who've never heard of it or read it, I highly recommend the book Killers of the Dream. which was a book written by a white woman in the South in 1949. And she talks a lot about how fundamentalism, sexism, and racism kind of are woven together within the culture of America. And so, yeah, I think that this sort of traumatic thing shows up all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're kind of at the end of the time, but if we'll maybe a last comment thrown up, otherwise we'll start shifting away. But my takeaway, thing I'm taking away from this is just like I'm trying to think about how to disarm, and this maybe is a question for another time. Like, when you get scared fundamentalists or people who are religiously indoctrinated in harmful ways, and they become afraid and they double down and they start doing toxic things, what does it look like to show compassion to them in a way that might help them kind of be healed? Like, that's a big question. Like, I mean, that's a way of looking at the question of like, what do we do with these folks who are making everything bad for everybody else? There's this, if anybody's not watching it on HBO, there's a show called The Plot Against America that's going on right now. It imagines what would have happened if Charles Lindbergh had become president instead of FDR during the rise of Nazism. And it's, in some ways, it deals with a lot of the stuff, how people go along with these really toxic things thinking it's not so bad. And then people out of their pain or, misguided, like scapegoating kind of things, start pushing this fascist agenda, and people kind of go along with it. And to me, this is the place we're in now. Like, and a lot of this, if I'm compassionate about it, is coming from pain and a need for healing, right? This is where trauma becomes abusive. Like, what does it look like? That's the big question I'm leaving.
Yeah, that's a good question to end with. So a couple of housekeeping things. We will not be broadcasting tomorrow. But Monday we will be back with another guest. I'm really excited about that. Greg Bentley, who's a Presbyterian minister in Huntsville, Alabama. He is also running for co-moderator of the National Presbyterian Church this year, and was one of Bernie Sanders' co-chairs in the state of Alabama. Really great guy. Very excited that he's going to be joining us to talk about a number of the things we've been discussing in terms of how the pandemic is revealing all kinds of important things we need to focus on. So that'll be really special and a lot of fun, and very grateful he's willing to do that. So come back and see us on Monday, or if you can't make it live, watch later.
Yep. And you can find these all by searching Transmission. Search for Transmission until you see something that looks like this little logo on the top. You're on Facebook, they're chronicled there, or also YouTube. If you search for the Center for Prophetic Imagination on YouTube, we have these videos there as well. And
all right,
we'll see you Monday, everybody.
See ya.